Hello, in this video lesson we're going to concentrate on a terrific trio of tools that share the same toolbox compartment, and that is here in the toolbox. If you click and hold down, you can see we have the blur tool, the sharpen tool and the smudge tool. I'm going to show you how you can get these tools to work together to improve a portrait, and then use this one here more artistically to create a painted effect on another photograph, which we'll look at later on. But let's kick off by opening up our start image, which is blur sharpen before.jpg. Now I'm using Photoshop CS5 for this particular tutorial, but you'll also find these tools in CS4, CS3 and also in all of the versions of Elements as well, but the keyboard shortcuts are slightly different. In Elements it's R, in Photoshop CS4 and 3 it's Shift and R, and in this particular version in CS5 there isn't an R keyboard shortcut, so you have to manually click and hold down to choose the tool. So let's start off with the Sharpen tool and I'll show you how that works. You could sharpen the image by going to a filter and sharpening the entire thing using the various settings in the filters, but that can also then bring out any extra image noise you've got, so it's worth just focusing on sharpening the areas you need to, like the eyes for example. Let's just Control plus to zoom in to around about 100%. You can see the value down in the bottom there, and if I press the spacebar I can temporarily activate the hand tool and we can see the eyes more clearly, because these are the areas we look at when we stare at a portrait. First of all we glance at the eyes, and if they're not nice and sharp then we can lose some contact or detail in the image. So what we're going to do is use this tool here to sharpen up the pixels a little bit more to give them more impact, which is especially useful if you're going to print out the shot. Now the cool thing about these brush-based tools is you can edit them on a separate layer, and that means you can erase bits that don't work, or even delete the layer and start working from scratch, or turn it on and off, or change its opacity to make a more subtle sharpening effect. So to do that, what we need to do is click here in the layers palette to add a new layer. I'm just going to open that up a little bit so you can see the new layer appear. There we go, it's layer 1, and make sure you click on that to target it so you're editing this layer and not the background layer. So once you've selected the Sharpen tool, we can selectively sharpen the eyes by popping up to the brush preset picker and choosing a nice soft edge brush. Set the size to 100 by dragging in the slider here, and then set the strength to 30%, because that enables you to sharpen in gentle, more controllable increments, and that keeps the artifacts like image noise down to a minimum. So that's fine for 30%, and sample all layers needs to be ticked as well, because you're clicking on this layer here but you're actually sharpening the details on the layer below. Talking of details, I'm just going to turn this one off for the moment and just hold the spacebar down, move over here, and this is like older versions of Photoshop. If I click and spray now and we sharpen this area here, you can see we've got blown out highlights, and we've also increased the contrast there as well, and we've just got some nasty image noise. This photograph was taken with an ISO speed of 400, so that is actually quite light sensitive, and that does add a lot of noise, especially to blurred backgrounds. And you can see how sharpening works. It's actually increasing contrast, which makes things stand out more. So it's kind of an illusion sharpening, and it's no real substitute to getting the picture nice and sharp in the first place. But as your camera can sometimes blur the photograph to stop distortion from moire patterns, then it's well worth adding a little bit of sharpening later on, especially if you're going to print the shot. So I'm going to Control Z to undo that rather nasty sharpening effect, and I'm going to turn on Protect Detail, and we'll get much better results. If we click and spray there now, it's much more subtle. Control Z to undo that as well, because what we're after is sharpening up the more important details of the eye. So if I just click and spray over this area using my 30% strength, I can then spray a few times. I'm going to do the eyebrows as well, and again over here, and also a little bit on the eyes too. And you can see as I spray we're getting a semi-transparent version on layer 1. Let me just go and do this area here as well. And because we've got Protect Detail, it's nice and subtle. If you're using older versions of Photoshop CS or Elements and you don't have this option, then use a lower strength and gently build up sharpening that way. Okay, when we turn this layer off, you can see the before and the after, and it's just increasing the contrast around these eyelashes here and making them stand out a little bit more. Let me do this area here. Watch the eyelashes, turn this off, turn it on, and it's just gently bringing out some delicate details. So once you've finished selectively sharpening the eyes, Control minus to zoom out, and what we'll do is grab the blur tool and use it as a digital powder puff just to hide some of these pores here on the subject's skin. And to do that we're going to go to choose a nice soft edge round tip, and set the size to 250. Let's pop the slider down to about 30% again, just to keep it nice and delicate, and of course make sure sample all layers is ticked. You'll also notice we have a tool here. This is good if you want to change the way the brush is behaving by using a stylus on a tablet, and that just gives you a little bit more organic control over your brush strokes. And so we're ready to click on the same layer here, and then just click and start to spray just to gently soften these pores and get a better skin complexion. I'm just going to go over these areas here, down under the mouth and round by the nose as well. And as I click and spray, you can see her healthier cheeks there are now appearing on the layer thumbnail, and we're just gently adding a smoother complexion to those areas. So we're sharpening the eyes and smoothing the skin on the same layer. Now, because we're only working on a particular part of the layer, you may not have the same thumbnail as I have, so you might need to pop into Options, pop down to Panel Options, and if you tick Entire Document, you will then see a much smaller preview of the pixels you're editing, but it's very good to go up to Panel Options again and choose Layer Bounds, and that will then only show you the actual pixels that you're adding to this layer thumbnail, and that just gives you a better look at those pixels in this little thumbnail. Okay, so you can turn that on and off to see the before and the after. You can see the skin is smoother now. Turn it off and the skin is more porous, if you like, but the eyes aren't as sharp. So that is a blurring and sharpening on the same layer, which is a very powerful way to delicately fine-tune your portraits. It's not an over-the-top edit, it's a very subtle edit, but it can just give the images the edge that you want. Our third tool is the smudge tool, which is down at the bottom here, and that can take a photograph like this, which is called Smudge Before, and turn it into a piece of artwork like this. And the cool thing is, because you're smudging with a brush tip, you're actually creating paint-like strokes that are more advanced and more subtle and more organic than just slapping a filter over the shot. So let's kick off and I'll show you how to get this type of effect using the smudge tool. So let's kick off by clicking here and dragging the thumbnail to the Create New Layer icon, and that gives us a copy which we are going to apply a filter to, and then going to apply the smudge tool to that filtered layer to create a more natural and individual and unique looking painting. But filter gives us a good starting point, so pop up to Filter, go down to Artistic, and then we're going to select Paint Daubs. And we can start off by setting brush size to 6, sharpness to 7, and set the brush type to simple. There's lots of other versions as well, but we just want a very stylized and simple looking paint daub effect, because we're going to actually brush over this with a smudge tool to create a more distinctive effect in just a tick. And you can see it's quite painted, but it's also very busy as well, so we need to simplify things using the smudge tool. But click OK to apply that filter to our background copy layer. I can then turn this layer on and off by clicking on the icon. There's the before, there's the after, and we have a slightly more stylized version. But we need to create a new layer to paint onto, so click here, and that's going to be our smudge tip layer. Make sure you've got the smudge tool selected and pop up to the brush preset picker, and then you can scroll down and choose a suitable tip. If we go down to around about here, you can see a variety of different tips. If you hover over them, you'll see the label of those particular tips, and the one we're after to start with is watercolor loaded wet flat tip. So we click on here, and then we pop up to the options bar. We can fine-tune the behavior of the smudge tool. So I'm going for quite a small brush tip size of 63 pixels, set the strength to around about 50%, so you've got a more subtle change there. Tick sample all layers and untick finger painting, because all that does is it adds a smudge of whatever foreground color you've got, and we don't really want that. We want to use the colors in the painting. We can then click and spray on layer 1 just to start smudging the details out from particular textures on the butterfly. You can also spray over these areas here to simplify them and create a more painted look. I'm also going to spray and use these colors here just to extend them down and create a more subtle and painted looking detail on the butterfly's main body like so. And this is just a great way of simplifying the rather busy filtered version and adding more organic brush strokes that are moving in appropriate directions as well, just to make it look more hand painted rather than computer generated. So after 10 minutes or so, you can end up with a shot that looks like this. Let me just turn off background copy and also the original background layer. And you can see on the top layer now, we've only got a few strokes of the smudge tool, but it's enough to combine it with the filtered layer to create a painted effect. And you can see I've changed the tip size and type as well for the background apples there by clicking here and scrolling down to this one here, which is the dry brush, and increasing its size as well. And that gives you more abstract strokes on the background here for the blurred out of focus areas. So let me just turn these back on again, and you can see that we've got our painted effect. And these are just a few brush tips, but if you click and then click on the flyout icon here, you can find loads of other brush tips to experiment with. There's natural brushes, round tips, and even square brush tips as well. You'll also find some interesting tips at the top here, and these little previews give you an idea of the type of stroke that these are going to produce. You can always click up here to see a preview of that particular tip. You can see it tapers off to the edge there, or if we go to another one like so, we get a more fan shaped and more organic. You can see the actual bristles there now. So there's loads of different ways to actually use brush tips with the smudge tool to create a painted effect.